to me, in case there are people who don't know me, haven't come across what I do before. My name is John. I use he, him pronouns. I have, at the moment, a fairly sparsely populated blog called The Haunt. I am the co-host of Horror Vanguard. My co-ghost is in chat today. Ash is here is my co-host and the producer of the show. It is a spooky podcast where we talk about scary movies, radical politics, leftist theory, and the need to drive a stake through the great monster that is contemporary capitalism. If you would like to keep me in academic PDFs, you can buy me some. You can send me some money through PayPal, and please do say hello over on Twitter at the Lit Crit Guy. That's me. So that is just a kind of brief introduction about who I am and what are we going to do. So first things first, we're going to have a very quick, very sort of shallow history of horror comics from roughly the 12th century to the present. Just going to skim over a few things. We'll take a quick break, as that is going to be the historical context that informs sections 2 and 3. Section 2, we're going to talk about maybe one of the more interesting comic writers of the late 20th and early 21st century, Alan Moore. Going to go over a brief biography, some work of theirs, some of the themes and style that they work within, before setting up our conversation about From Hell. The third section is going to be where we talk about the text in question. And I have two kind of subheadings for that section, which is that capitalism is a religion, and finally, a Gothic theory of history, or what is the fourth dimension. Just a brief warning that this will include almost complete spoilers for From Hell, but if you have listened to Horror Vanguard, you should know that we don't care about spoilers. I don't think spoilers really ruin anyone's enjoyment of a particular work, but can actually help us appreciate it in a new way. I'm sure there are people here who have read From Hell and are very familiar with Moore's work, but if you haven't, hopefully this is going to help persuade you that it's something that you should check out. So, without further ado, let us consider the history that we're talking about. And I started with just this slide. We're talking about the Jack the Ripper murders, even in a fictionalized version. So, but these are real people who lived and died in really shocking and terrifying conditions. Their identities are often marginalized or elided when it comes to talking about Jack the Ripper. But Mary Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly were real people who lived and died in Whitechapel in the late 1880s. And I started this morning by just kind of taking a minute to reflect on there's a kind of ethical imperative, I think, to pay attention to the victims of male misogynistic violence that are often kind of obscured when we start talking about the fictionalization of history. But before we get to talking about that in more detail, let's talk about how we got here. So let's talk about some of the history of horror comics. And there is a kind of fascinating genealogy, multiple genealogies that we could construct. If we wanted to go really back centuries and centuries, we could talk about the Mixtec group codexes from Oaxaca in Mexico, what is now Mexico rather, or the Gakuzashi scrolls from Japan, the legend of the hungry ghost. But as I said, these kind of myriad genealogies, and what I wanted to do is kind of flag up the fact that there's a multiplicity and of different streams feeding into horror comics as we would come to recognize them in the 20th century. So we could talk about theatre publicity that goes all the way back to the first Gothic adaptations. We could talk about the chapbooks and penny dreadfuls from the 19th century, or we could talk about the long and complex history of illustration in Gothic fiction. Maybe the most interesting one there is to talk about the work of Edgar Allan Poe. Poe's reception, particularly among European artists, is really fascinating because Poe is someone with a very clear sense of aesthetics and composition, and a lot of that is responded to by artists who draw on Poe's work. Basically, horror and visualization have always gone hand in hand. So we have this kind of long-running idea of the representation of ghosts and the supernatural that goes all the way back to the Gakuzoshi scrolls. We have the frontispieces of Gothic novels in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. We have this long, complex history of chapbooks and penny dreadfuls, of the trash of the circulating libraries. And by the 1890s, we have the emergence of the pulp magazines, cheaply printed, often boys' own style adventure stories. Probably the most famous author that would be included in this kind of category is someone like H. Rider Haggard. Lots of stories of exotic adventures in the far-flung corners of the empire, as a very kind of crucial and important way into thinking through this. One that doesn't often get talked about, but I think is very kind of important, is Hogan's Alley. So as the American population grew, particularly in New York City, there were a massive explosion in daily newspapers. Of course, as a part of the world with a huge immigrant community, most of whom didn't speak English, the New York Post launched Hogan's Alley, which today we would probably call a funny page. It was what are essentially racist cartoons. It was done by Joseph Pulitzer, yes, that Pulitzer, who wanted a way of making sure that his publications were appealing not just to people who spoke and read English, but people who were particularly Asian communities and particularly European, German-speaking communities, the Jewish community. So that was quickly became very popular and was heavily copied and imitated. So lots of the daily presses in New York would introduce cartoons. And so this was a chance for people to actually start copying them. People who would read the newspapers would start drawing things at home. You had the birth of American comics culture. A few of the biggest pulp magazines, short stories, which starts in 1890, Argosy, which is very famous, which starts in 1896, the wonderfully and very modestly titled Popular Magazine from 1903, the Blue Book from 1905, and Adventure from 1910. Now, what is going to become very clear is that already there are kind of some problems and criticisms of the growth and explosion of interest in pulp magazines, in these adventure stories that are mostly aimed at the young. And as I said this morning, this kind of echoes a lot of the sort of moral concerns that people had about the Gothic, historically speaking. So, back in the early 1800s, public authority figures would rail against Gothic novels as being a distraction and overly stimulating the imagination of young women, particularly famously referenced in Austen's Northanger Abbey. You see a similar kind of moral panicking starting in American publications. The Ladies' Home Journal in 1909 was describing the pulp magazine kind of explosion as a crime against American children. It's very much that gif of Helen Lovejoy from The Simpsons. Won't somebody think of the children? And a few kind of the images that I was talking about. On the top left here, we see a Gakuzashi scroll. The legends of the Hungry Ghosts is a really interesting one, and it's very closely tied up to Japanese indigenous religions, Taoism, Buddhism, all have variations on it. At the bottom here, we have Gustave Doré's illustration of the Raven. Doré, as many other French painters, were really inspired by Poe's work. Frank Langella's production, the Edward Gorey designed production of Dracula, is a wonderful piece of artwork, which I'm deeply fond of. And of course, this is the famous frontispiece to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So there's this kind of long, complicated artistic semiotics that stretches back centuries, that gets fed into these pulp magazines and these kind of early progenitors of American comics. Let's jump ahead just a little bit. So if we kind of see there's an explosion in comics in the early 1900s, by the time we get to post-World War II, the mood of the comics industry has kind of changed a little bit. And this echoes a shift in the kind of ideological contours of the American cultural imaginary more broadly. You know, World War II is a kind of seismic event culturally, and the big aesthetic influence here is the rise and change in film noir, particularly. So, you know, instead of having good all-American heroes, now we had noir private eyes who were kind of shady and broke the law and probably didn't really think they could fix the vast tide of corruption that they were confronted with. The other big influence on the aesthetics and art style and composition of the comics industry is alongside film noir is German expressionism, and you can see here on the gloriously garish cover of Eerie Comics #1 from January 1947, a classic bit of German expressionism, chiaroscuro lighting, deep shadows, and our sinister figure threatening the beautiful woman in the red dress. So December 1940, Prize Comics issued #7, do a Frankenstein adaptation. June 1943, Classic Comics #12 is an adaptation of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. 1943, a few months later, they bring out an adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde. And these are, by this point, kind of respectable comics that can avoid a lot of the moral outrage and moral criticisms that's being thrown at them because it's literary. And obviously, this raises a lot of interesting questions about how do we construct canonicity and what is the kind of status of Gothic and horror art and culture, which has traditionally been quite transgressive and marginal, and as it's developed, has often been incorporated into the kind of ideological structure of the canon. You know, I teach in Gothic studies, which would be unthinkable, really, to kind of study the Gothic seriously a century ago. So Eerie Comics #1 is generally regarded as the first kind of proper horror comic that isn't kind of just doing an adaptation. And then comes the legendary publishing house that is EC Comics, which in 1950 runs for 91 issues across 3 separate titles: The Haunt of Fear, The Vault of Horror, and The Incredible Crypt of Terror. There in the bottom right, you can see the famous Crypt Keeper of EC Comics. So EC Comics was originally called Educational Comics. It was set up and spent a lot of its time doing adaptations of biblical stories. It was very respectable. The publisher then died and left the company to his son. The company was vastly in debt, and they moved into horror comics because they thought it'd be an easy way of making some money. And they were correct. They were enormously successful, and of course pioneered the use of the horror host with the Crypt Keeper. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that these horror comics were the most popular cultural form in America at the time and spawned a host of imitators. Every other publishing house wanted to get out a horror comics book because it's going to generate revenue. It was, as I say, it's more popular than the movies. It's cheaper. It's more easy to distribute, and it's enormously popular among the young. So, a kind of few points that I think are worth picking out the EC Comics as an example. The influences are the adaptations of apparently canonical Gothic texts. The big 3 that come up again and again are Poe, Irving, and Shelley. Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde gets a few adaptations, but falls behind the big 3. Noir, particularly from the post-World War II period. True crime was becoming a much bigger influence as well. And earlier in the 1900s, so between the 20s and 30s, were very much a sci-fi boom, and science fiction and thrillers were starting to feed into the semiotics of how comics kind of were constructing themselves. So what I wanted to kind of flag up is that this is a hybridized version of an already hybridized mode of cultural production. You know, for those of us who work in Gothic and horror studies, we talk a lot about hybridity, about the ways in which the Gothic has emerged out of, you know, romance. If you go back to the introduction to the Castle of Otranto, it's hybridized. Arguably, Shelley hybridizes it with science fiction. And the comics hybridize things again. So it becomes a kind of hybrid of a hybrid, a splicing together of all of these different aesthetic, formal, and thematic influences. So to me, this is a very early and compelling example of the plasticity of the high-low cultural divide. We're still in the kind of tail end of what we would periodize as modernism, and this is trying to incorporate literature with very kind of graphic, gory, subversive humor. Um, and I want to kind of stress that a lot of this is a kind of insight into um, something that's maybe not talked about enough with these comics, which is the relationship to class and comics. Comics were cheap; they were cheap to make, they were cheap to buy, and they were a kind of working class art form. Some of the earliest comic writers and illustrators in American comics history, people like Will Eisner, grew up very poor. They grew up copying the cartoons they saw in the newspapers. They would drop out of school, or they would go to art school for a year, and then they would go to New York because they wanted to write comics. So it does have this kind of class element to it, which I think is important to pay attention to as well. If we're talking about comics, we have to have a splash page. So where did it all go wrong? Or seduction of the innocent. So we're into the 50s. The comics boom is in full swing. Where did it all go so wrong? It's very tempting to pin the blame just on one person. That would be a little unfair, but probably the person who did the most to end the comics boom is Friedrich Wertham, who was a German-born psychiatrist. Now, when I get into talking about Wertham, it'll be very easy to say that he was a slightly reactionary figure, which is not true in the slightest. He was very concerned with the idea of progressive societal and cultural change. He was very close with Ralph Ellison, the author of An Invisible Man, and was responsible for establishing the Paul Lafarge Clinic in the basement of a church in Harlem in New York, which was one of, if not the first, free to access psychiatric healthcare facilities for Black people in America. So he was virulently anti-comics. He saw them as kind of propagating almost fascistic tendencies. Saw the Superman as a kind of the superhero as a dangerous exaggeration of the Übermensch, the overman, the one who could break all of the societal norms and regulations. Comics were interested in sex and violence, particularly the horror comics, and they were read incredibly widely by young people. And so he makes this very provocative argument that they're akin to a kind of Nazi propaganda. So he publishes Seduction of the Innocent in 1954, which is full of anecdotal data and kind of stories of people who have, usually young men who've confessed to finding comics arousing or being drawn to the violence in them. At the same time, there is this broader kind of culture-wide moral panicking about crime and young people's culture. We will see much the same rhetoric repeated in the early 2000s around heavy metal and video games, particularly in the wake of tragedies like Columbine. And so there is called the Senate Committee on Juvenile Delinquency. Wertham insists on testifying. He was an excellent self-publicist, probably out of necessity, if I'm being charitable. And so he goes and testifies before the committee, explaining his opinion that these things are deeply dangerous and are encouraging a kind of cultural degeneracy. They're encouraging children to be lawbreakers, to think individualistically. They're encouraging a kind of sexual deviancy and interest in violence. And the biggest thing was that they were encouraging children to hide comics from their parents. So he gives this very kind of shocking testimony. So the Senate committee summons publishers of the various comics to come and testify, basically to try and get them to explain themselves, to explain what it is that they've been doing. And the Senate Committee on Juvenile Delinquency brings William Gaines, who is the publisher of EC Comics, in front of the committee. And he's asked by Senator Estevez Kefauver, Democrat of Tennessee, if he considered in good taste the cover of his shock suspense stories the cover of which is on the right-hand side of the screen, which depicted an axe-wielding man holding aloft the severed head of a blonde woman. Mr. Gaines replied, "Yes, I do, for the cover of a horror comic. It's in very good taste." He said the thing that would make it not in good taste would be if there was dripping blood from the blade and from the woman's head. This did not go well for William Gaines. He was a very canny publisher. He was a very good businessman. He was not very good at the political side of things, and had been very slow to kind of pick up on the fact that there was a wider kind of cultural backlash coming. So the Senate committee said that they could not force the industry they couldn't change laws to make the industry regulate them, to regulate the industry. So the industry was heavily encouraged to regulate itself. And by around 1953, 20 to 25%, depending on how you categorize things, of all the comics published in the US were horror comics. And so the backlash from the Senate Committee on Juvenile Delinquency resulted in the industry forming the CCA, the Comics Code Authority. Now, this was voluntary self-regulation of the entire industry. Things which did not abide by the CCA would not find distribution. And the CCA was extremely strict about what could and could not be shown. No violence, no hint of sexual impropriety in any way, no gore, certainly. And this basically ends the horror comics boom at a stroke. There were a few publishers that tried to get around the restrictions of the CCA, but if the CCA could block you from distribution, that was honestly very difficult to do. The first standards were not relaxed until 1971, and the CCA was not completely defunct until 2011. It's a very kind of McCarthyite way of trying to keep creatives in line, I think. And as I said this morning, some credit has to go to people like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who were instrumental in kind of pushing Marvel away from the CCA and actually breaking some kind of cultural space for comics to be a bit more innovative. So before we get on to Alan Moore, I will stop there and we can see if anyone has any questions. I absolutely adore this picture of Alan Moore that's up on the screen. Just what an icon. And we can see what people think about this kind of historical context, the kind of groundwork that I've tried to lay. And we can see how that groundwork informs a lot of what Moore is doing and maybe some of the things that he is responding to. So one thing that's really interesting when you're dealing with someone who is very prolific, or you're dealing with a span of time in which there's a lot of cultural change, is that you always end up having to make choices around how you periodize and classify somebody's work. I am convinced, obviously, there will be people on the call who probably know more about Moore's work than I do. So I'm not going to try and do a recap of all of his work. That would take the full hour. These are what I think to be kind of key touch points in his development. Language comes first, Moore says. It's not that language grows out of consciousness. If you haven't got language, you can't be conscious. So born in 1953 in Northampton in the East Midlands, has been there ever since. Born in, as many comic writers have been, was born in a working class family, grew up very poor, was thrown out of school for dealing LSD in the 70s, and immediately started writing and drawing cartoons and comics, which again, I think is true of a lot of people who are interested in drawing and in narrative art. It's something that you do from a very young age. So he got started writing and drawing for local zines and newspapers. The Adventures of Maxwell the Magic Cat, which it's very weird. And then as his work got a little more well-known, he started contributing stories to 2000 AD and Marvel UK. He wrote regularly for Future Shocks, basically sci-fi 8-page stories, adventures on alien planets, adventures in time travel, that kind of thing. He started working for Warrior, another big UK comics publisher, in March 1982, which is where the first issues of V for Vendetta were published. In 1983, Len Wein, who was the head of DC Comics, comes a calling, and Moore is the first British writer to do some major work for a big US comic publisher, with what I think is a genuinely brilliant run on a much neglected DC comic character, Swamp Thing. What Moore was very good at was basically kind of going back into the archives of these bigger comic companies and pulling out heroes or characters that had sort of been forgotten or weren't seen as very cool anymore, and basically reinventing their mythology whole cloth. Swamp Thing is an incredible comic. It introduces genuinely my favorite character in all comics, which is John Constantine, a working class gingerhead magician from Liverpool who doesn't really have any magic powers, but is just kind of like a confidence trickster. 1986, he writes Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, widely regarded as one of the best Superman comics ever written, and is honestly, I think, of his mainstream stuff, is maybe one of my favorite things he's ever done. 1986, he also writes Watchmen. So Watchmen is one of those comics which is talked about in the same terms as things like Art Spiegelman's Mouse. It is where comics. It's a comic that is not really just a comic, although I will refer to these as comics throughout. The term Moore famously says that the term graphic novel was invented by a marketing guy somewhere, and I think I've read that he likes calling them comics because it ties back to the fact that comics were cheaply made, cheaply produced, and cheaply written for working class kids who liked writing and drawing stories. He gets a chance to do another very, very famous comic called The Killing Joke, which is not very good, in my opinion. That's my hot take. It's weirdly cliche in places, but was very, very highly talked up and very well regarded in the comics world for a long time as being a fantastic Batman story. It's all right. He then moves to another publishing company called Taboo, which allows him to do some more controversial, weirder, more underground stories, including the very first issue of From Hell. From Hell took 10 years to complete, and it would outlast Taboo and at least one other publisher. Late 80s, he also starts to write Lost Girls with Melinda Gebbie, the kind of legendary underground American illustrator who they would eventually marry. And it's an attempt to write what they call intelligent pornography. He has an excellent essay on the 25,000-year-long history of pornography called From Bog Venus. I can't remember the exact title. I sent it to Ash, and maybe he can put it in the chat. But the issue around Lost Girls was that it got him into an awful lot of trouble with Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. As you can probably tell from the name, it's a play on the Lost Boys of Peter Pan. And The Lost Girls does feature Wendy from Peter Pan as a grown woman recounting her sexual adventures. And Great Ormond Street got quite annoyed about this because that's technically their intellectual property. He returns to DC in 1993 and then, in a kind of wonderfully dismissive phrase, says he spends his time writing better than average stories for 13 to 15-year-olds, which I think is damning it with faint praise, frankly. Increasingly, he gets very frustrated with how the big publishers treat their writers and artists. They tend not to control a lot of the rights to the work. So he leaves again in the late 90s and sets up his own imprint, America's Best Comics, and publishes, honestly, some really, really interesting stuff there. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which was adapted into a film, of which we will not speak. Tom Strong, Promethea, and the Tomorrow Stories. So he kind of leans into his independence again, and the 2000s is basically a period of him concluding many stories, kind of wrapping things up, and then announces an official retirement from comics in 2019, although he is still involved with work on film and TV and writing novels. So enormously prolific, and I've only kind of really skimmed the surface because I want to spend quite a lot of our time delving into From Hell. But if you want to know a little bit about Moore as a person, his cameo on The Simpsons, I think, is very informative.
Look at all these alternative comic book creators. Alan Moore, Art Spiegelman, oh, Dan Clowes. I really identified with the girls in Ghost World. They made me feel like I wasn't so alone.
Yeah, whatever. Do you know anyone who works at Batman? 'Cause I really want to draw Batman. I'm awesome at utility belts. Check these out. This is where the Batman keeps his money, in case he has to take the bus.
Mm-hmm.
Alan Moore, you wrote my favorite issues of Radioactive Man.
Oh, really? So you like that I made your favourite superhero a heroin-addicted jazz critic who's not radioactive?
I don't read the words. I just like when he punches people. How do you make his costume stick so close to his muscles? Mr. Moore, will you sign my DVD of Watchmen Babies? Which of the babies is your favorite?
You see what those bloody corporations do? They take your ideas and they suck them. Suck them like leeches until they've gotten every last drop of the marrow from your bones.
Hey, Teacup, why don't you chill out?
Very well. Oh, little Lulu, I love you, Lou, just the same.
There we go. I'll stop there. In the kind of comics world, Moore is sort of seen as the grumpy old man of the scene now in many ways. And I think some of his criticisms of how the major publishers take your work and own a lot of the rights, he's been right just as much as he's been wrong. And this kind of also ties into his kind of refusal to have his name associated with any of the film adaptations of his work, which we will probably get into in the discussion section. But a cameo that he did 2007, I think. Let's just jump ahead a little bit. So a few of the kind of motifs and themes that run through his work, a few of the Gothic influences, Clive Barker, William Blake. Blake is maybe the big influence on a lot of From Hell, if you've read it. Thomas Pynchon and William Burroughs in terms of their interest in structure. Lovecraft, of course. He's written his own Lovecraft comics. Again, I don't recommend them. They're a challenging read, is what I will charitably say about his Lovecraft stories. And a big fan and sort of compatriot and comrade of the legendary British science fiction and fantasy writer Michael Moorcock. When he turned 40 years old, he declared himself a ceremonial magician. I've read interviews with him where he talks about this as a kind of quite profound sounding religious experience. So he is extremely interested in the occult, the practice of ceremonial magic, tarot, Kabbalah, the work of Aleister Crowley, the history of the Theosophists in Britain. And he has as his own personal kind of mascot and demigod, Glykon the snake puppet. This is a kind of tongue-in-cheek joke as Glykon was a Roman god, I believe, from the 2nd century, who was exposed as a fraud. And so the whole point is you have this fraud as your own personal symbol. One thing that is a very clear theme through a lot of his work is the nature of time, mathematics, and philosophy. There's a very strong formalist and almost structuralist way to how Moore structures comics. And I talked about this a little bit in the morning session, but I wanted to bring it up again. It has a kind of what we would call the popular modernist aesthetic. So this popular modernism was a term coined by Mark Fisher. And Fisher argued that popular culture could have just the same kind of intellectual impact as the kind of modernist high culture of the early 20th century. I think pretty much everybody has had a experience with a bit of popular culture that has kind of fundamentally, it's sort of like rewires your brain, you know? If we were to put this in kind of more Marxist terms, maybe we could say it sort of raises your consciousness. You know, a cultural encounter, you know, it might have been a TV show, it might have been a film, it might have been a comic book, it might have been a piece of music that kind of fundamentally connected you, not just to the work itself, but to ideas, to kind of a philosophical and intellectual kind of background that you were previously unaware of. And I would absolutely class some of Alan Moore's work at its best as a kind of popular modernism. It tends to be quite subversive. It is explicitly anti-authoritarian, anti-fascist. If you have seen the adaptation of V for Vendetta, please do yourself a favor and read the original V for Vendetta, which was written in the midst of Thatcherite Britain and is this kind of chilling exploration of how Britain would quite easily kind of fall into a fascist politics. Interestingly, he's been very interested in issues of gender, feminism, and queer sexualities. There's a lot of non-heteronormative relationships in his work. And this is tied up with a very kind of keen interest in eroticism and sexuality. He's written, as I said, written extensively about pornography. And I think there are some interesting critiques that we can make here of him as an author who has used. This is why I don't think The Killing Joke is very good. An awful lot of very unpleasant and sexual things happen to a character in that, Barbara Gordon, specifically with the intent of upsetting her father. It's again weirdly cliche. It's quite exploitative, but there is also this interest in for more, as I think for quite a lot of a kind of more libertarian anarchist tradition, sexual liberation and political liberation necessarily go hand in hand. So Lost Girls and From Hell. I really like that clip from The Simpsons, but it's very funny to me that he's there signing copies of From Hell and Lost Girls, which you absolutely should not give to young people. And finally, one of the kind of themes and motifs I wanted to pick up on is this connection between the personal, the universal, and the political. So there are frequently these kind of moments of transcendence in Moore's work where a personal subject, a single subject, becomes aware of a kind of universal consciousness. Maybe the most famous one would be Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen. Absolutely happens in From Hell as well. So this move from the personal and the individual to the universal and the cosmic. But that is never entirely kind of abstracted away from kind of political concerns. Hopefully some of these themes and issues will become more clear as we get into a closer reading of the text. So I want to stop there just briefly, and hopefully that has kind of provoked some questions and some thoughts for people. And we can maybe talk a little bit about his work and influences before we go into talking about From Hell itself. This is a panel from the prologue. We have Fred Aberline there on the left of the first frame, talking to Robert Lees, another character in the story. But Lees is a psychic, but he confesses to Aberline that he made it all up, never had any visions. And Aberline says, but what you said, everything you said, it all happened. It was all true. I made it all up and it all came true anyway. That's the funny part. So From Hell, originally published in serial form between 1989 to 1998, took a long time to pull together. It is a self-described holistic murder mystery. So in order to solve one crime, it isn't enough to figure out who did that one particular act, but you would need to solve the entire society in which the crime occurs. So what kind of horror is From Hell? If you've read it, you absolutely know that it is a horror comic, and in many ways it's antithetical to that EC Comics horror style. It's much more explicitly violent. I've decided not to show any of the most violent pages or panels in the talk. I just didn't think that would be appropriate if people haven't read it before. And there is this kind of very flat, realistic aesthetic to the art. It's done in these monochromatic black and white pencil sketches. The art, I think, is amazing. They did a colorized version, which personally, I think is very impressive. But personally, I really do think that the black and white version has kind of real power to it. And there's this kind of flat realism in the art, which echoes the formal conventions of the text. It's a very structurally interesting text, which links again here to the 19th century novel of the city, the work of people like Gaskell and Dickens. So it is not necessarily as exploitative, and it kind of runs contrary to how a great deal of quote unquote Ripperology works. Happily, that is starting to change, that people who write about the Jack the Ripper narrative are not writing about it in the same kind of prurient and almost voyeuristic manner that a lot of the Ripper narrative has been turned into. And a kind of point that I want to put front and center in this section is that asking who is Jack the Ripper is the wrong question to ask. So I have a quote from an interview with Alan Moore talking about From Hell. It's a little bit long, but I think it illustrates really perfectly the kind of things that I've been trying to say here. This is the same thing we get in cinema, where the gore is spectacular and where the reaction of the audience generally is the same as it was with those EC comics. It's to laugh, in a kind of dark and morbid fashion, perhaps, but to laugh nonetheless. I think that's because there's something about the signals and symbols that we surround our various genres with. And with a horror comic or a horror film, right from the title lettering, you're going to know that this is what you're looking at. If the title lettering is red and kind of drippy, then this is a horror book, this is a horror film, this is a horror comic. And I think at that point, we all kind of switch over into horror mode, where we understand that what we're being shown on the screen is kind of entertainment. It's all ketchup. There's no blood. It's a kind of vicarious thrill. It's a sort of roller coaster ride. We're not in any danger of being harmed, and yet we have that vicarious thrill of fear followed by the release of laughter. Sort of, no, that's not actually very horrifying. That's taking the coward's way out, as far as I'm concerned. With From Hell, given the nature of the material, given that this is essentially about one man killing 5 fairly anonymous women in the back streets of London's poorest quarter during the late 1880s, it didn't seem appropriate to me to dress it up in that kind of jokey clothing that the horror genre generally comes equipped with. I'd seen a number of Ripper films that almost became a kind of pornography, where the images were always the same. They would show you the unrealistically attractive 1880s prostitute walking down a street after dark, perhaps tunelessly and drunkenly singing some English song of the period. Then perhaps you'd see a shadow of a man in a top hat with a Gladstone bag cast upon a glistening cold wall. She notices someone behind her. Her steps increase, echoing upon the cobbles. His steps increase. She ducks down alleyways. She's breathing faster now. He's following her. We perhaps get a shot of the knife upraised, her face. She screams, then blood splashes over perhaps a musical poster. The next shot is the policeman turning up saying, "Oh my God," and then blowing his whistle. I mean, this is making it exciting. I mean, this is a very sordid, miserable, unfair little death in a back alleyway in London. I don't think that that's appropriate to make it part of this teasing dance. What I wanted to do was make it actually a genuine horror book, if you like, in that I wouldn't allow the readers that escape. If they wanted to see what it was like to cut up women, then I wanted to show them the plain and awful truth of it, unadorned, particularly in the Mary Kelly chapter, where we spend almost the entire 40-page episode in a room with him cutting up the final victim. By the end of it, I'm sure that the readers, just like me and Eddie, that's Eddie Campbell, the artist, were begging to get out of that room. It's something where I think I felt a responsibility to myself, to the book, and weirdly, I think to those women, to actually show this in as cold and unemotional a light as possible. Again, a long quote, but I think a really illuminating one that kind of explains his own understanding of what From Hell is trying to do. And I wanted to kind of link back to those 5 names. You know, that these were real people who lived and died in a way that we shouldn't kind of elide. And I do think he has a point there of the way there's a kind of ethics of dealing with history. If the Gothic and horror is, there's a great quote from Victor Sage who says that the Gothic is essentially a fantasy about history, which is a great quote for academics because we can, in many contexts, we can go, yes, that's right. And in some contexts, we get to go, no, that's wrong. But if it is a fantasy about history, actually trying to make it something that seems a bit more kind of real, whatever that might mean, I think is something that's very interesting and worth kind of paying some attention to. So let's kind of think about this in terms of, as I said, a religion, a political theology. So Walter Benjamin in 1921, the late great Benjamin, wrote a short fragment called "Capitalism as a Religion." It wasn't published until after his death. And in this fragment, Benjamin says that there are 3 features of the religion that capitalism is. Firstly, it is cultic, as in it doesn't have any dogma, it doesn't have any doctrine that you have to follow. It is a permanent religion. There is no time off. You are always a believer. You are always involved. You are always implicated. And thirdly, it is a religion of pervasive guilt. What's interesting about this is it runs kind of counter to how a lot of philosophers and cultural critics have talked about religion in the 20th century. Maybe the most influential one here is a book by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor called A Secular Age, where Taylor says that essentially religious belief imposes a sort of unitary ideological worldview. You know, if you were a European peasant in the Middle Ages, it wouldn't really make sense to declare that you didn't think God existed. You know, that doesn't kind of work. Then he says that actually the secular age is the age in which a religious understanding becomes just one narrative among many that you can choose from in the public sphere to help you make sense of your life. This often gets written about in terms of disenchantment as well. This idea that capitalism's relentless quantification of the non-material has disenchanted reality. Benjamin actually makes a very interesting and what I think is a very provocative point, which is that no, this kind of religious ideology, this religious sense, this religious understanding of the world is still present. It's just shifted into a brand new direction. This brings us on quite neatly, I think, to political theology. It's a very contested term. So what is political theology? You ask 10 theologians what it is, you'll get 25 different answers. As I said in the earlier session, this is just my definition. It's not the only definition. It may not even be the right one. So in my mind, political theology is not just about the homology between the two fields of politics and theology. It isn't just about the fact that we can go, well, politics seems to run on similar logics to that we would find in theology, but it's about the problem which undergirds both fields. So in political terms, it's the question of legitimating authority. How do we legitimate political power? Is it done through the divine sovereignty of the king? Is it done through a democratic mandate? Is it done through the mass line struggle of the proletarian class coming to consciousness of itself? How do we do that? In theological terms, the question is the question of evil. These are the two motivating questions of political theology. As I said, I am going to spoil most of the plot of From Hell for people who've not read it. So William Withy Gull is doing is an exercise in occult theological practice, as we'll get into, and is an attempt to create a legitimating authority for misogynistic imperialist capitalism. So for those of you who have not read it, the plot of From Hell is structured on two levels. At the opening, Prince Albert Victor marries Annie Crook, a sweet shop worker, and secretly fathers a child with her. Hearing this, Queen Victoria enlists Sir William Withy Gull, royal surgeon and physician, to impair the sanity of Annie, which he does through removing her thyroid gland and leaving her committed in Guy's hospital. A group of sex workers gains word of the illegitimate royal baby and tries to blackmail the royal family. They're in desperate need of raising some money because they're all being threatened by a street gang. Gull then wages a campaign of violence against the women, whilst various high-ranking police officials and members of high society deliberately turn a blind eye. Second level. Sir William Withy Gull is a high-ranking Mason who uses the opportunity presented to conduct a series of ritualistic murders to ensure male domination over women in perpetuity. This is prompted by a religious experience that Gull has at the age of 70, wherein he sees a vision of the Masonic deity Yah-Bulon. The murders are not simply designed to safeguard the crown, but are occult sacraments designed to instantiate modernity itself. And these two levels of the plot operate entirely in unison. We can just read this as about Moore solving the Jack the Ripper case. We can, but I think that's missing a great deal. Moore bases this on a book that was written in the mid-70s by a ripperologist, much of which has been discredited, but the From Hell itself is actually very meticulously well-researched. And huge amounts, in fact, pretty much all of the characters who appear were actual historical figures, even if what they say has been fictionalized. So here is Sir William Withy Gull talking to his coachman assistant, Netley. And he explains in just a few sentences this split that I've been talking about. I had a stroke. Did I tell you that? It caused aphasia, a fluxion of the brain's right side that yields hallucinations. Netly, I saw God. I knelt before him, and he told me what to do. And Gull, the doctor, says, why? To converse with gods is madness. And Gull, the man, replies, then who'd be sane? This comes in the middle of a fantastic chapter, which is a kind of exploration of the occult history and geography of London. And Gull is a very interesting character. Again, a real existing historical figure. I refer to him as a character, though. And he goes into a lot of detail about the materiality of consciousness. You know, how does the brain actually work? And what happens if we accept that yes, gods and spirits and the immaterial might be hallucinations, but why have we stopped being able to hallucinate? He talks a lot here about William Blake and Blake's divine visions. And what does it mean to say that you've had a religious experience in a world that might call that being insane? So let's go through kind of the three Benjaminian points of capitalism as a cultic religion. So there is no dogma or theology per se. Gull is not following kind of divine law. He's involved with the Masons. He's a very high-ranking member of the Masonic order. But in his chapter 4, which is the chapter those previous panels were from, he kind of draws on all of history. There is a syncretic religion happening here. Everything is incorporated. Everything is drawn together to construct a kind of totalizing system of metaphysics that draws literally on all of recorded history. There are the links, obviously, between the Masonic lodges and the institutions of the nation. He is invited to join the Masons when he enrolls at Guy's Hospital as a medical lecturer. It's good for your career. It's good for your economic power. So Masons, brother Masons, as they refer to themselves, are there to help one another. But they're also there to kind of construct this way of looking and interpreting history so that literally everything can become grist for the mill, as it were. So chapter 4 is this, it's honestly kind of incredible if you just sit down and read it. It's this 40-page long psychogeographic and theological lecture between Gull and his coachman assistant, who's been given to him to kind of help him track down the women, where Gull outlines what he calls the war betwixt sun and moon, wherein all history has been conscripted. The thing that people might remember most about this chapter is the tour of the churches in London designed by Sir Nicholas Hawksmoor. Hawksmoor was a very interesting figure. Also, Gull claims connected to the Masons, and it was a pagan architect who incorporated bizarre occultic symbology into these ostensibly Christian designs. So these Hawksmoor churches become temples to the great architect. And there is this kind of occult theologos that becomes sort of an all-encompassing hermeneutic net. You know, everything around you, everything that surrounds you, the very material fabric of the world that you live in gets folded into this cosmic metaphysics of this eternal struggle between the sun and moon, between the male and the female. As Gull puts it to Netley, splendid. By chance, our lesson for today requires of you no further scholarship. The greater part of London's story is not writ in words. It is instead a literature of stone, of place names and associations, where faint echoes answer back from off the distant ruined walls of bloody history. You know, the obvious association here is, if you've read Walter Benjamin's Theses on the Philosophy of History, Benjamin talks about the angel of history blown backwards by the storm from paradise, and the debris left behind is what we call that storm that blows the angel of history back forward through time is what we call progress. And Gull kind of reformulates this, that all of history gets reincorporated and reinterpreted back into this ongoing kind of cosmic struggle of of sexuality and divinity. This is maybe one of my favorite panels from the chapter. This is where they've come to the end of their journey and they've arrived at St. Paul's Church in Spitalfields. Netley is told to draw out the route that they have crossed and connect the various landmarks that they've stopped at. Oh God, says Netley. Haha, yes, says Gull, but not yours. Sorry, let me just jump back. But not yours. Draw bisectors till they cross. St. Paul's is in the center. We're at the center of the pattern now, Netley. Netley goes outside screaming about that he's going to be sick, throws up on the steps of the church and starts screaming about the dangers of black magic. But as Gull puts it, you can't escape your destiny. If you're a Londoner, you live in this occult geography. You're bound up within the kind of violent history of this kind of spiritual war that he's outlining. So if it is a cultic one, it's not a religion with any kind of dogma. What is Gull trying to achieve? So his murders are both entwined with the day-to-day politics of the time, as well as the formative forces of the modern age. The 1880s saw the invention of the light bulb, the motor car, radio waves, vaccines, the discovery of cell division, and of course, discoveries that would lead to the theory of relativity and inexorably towards Hiroshima. On the right-hand side of this screen, you'll see a little screenshot from the appendixes to From Hell, where Moore basically comments on all of the sources that he used. And there is this little throwaway remark, which I actually think is really important. So Moore says, in many ways, it seems to me that the 1880s contain the seeds of the 20th century, not only in terms of politics and technology, but also in the fields of art and philosophy as well. The suggestion that the 1880s embody the essence of the 20th century, along with the attendant notion that the Whitechapel murders embody the essence of the 1880s, is central to From Hell, and we shall no doubt return to it later. Like now. So what is Gull trying to do? Gull is trying to bring into birth modernity itself. And this raises some very interesting questions, which I hope we can get into about what is the relationship in this text between this conception of modernity and things like violence and imperialism and misogyny. So just after one of the final murders, he returns to his coachman, Netley, who says, so William, I was just resting my eyes like, have you done, sir? Is it finished with? And Gull says, it is beginning, Netley, only just beginning. Better or worse, the 20th century. I have delivered it. I said I didn't want to include a lot of the violence, and I've left out really just about all of it as much as I could. This is from that final chapter that Moore was talking about in the quote, chapter 11, which is honestly, even I find it difficult to read. The art gives it this kind of flat realism. It's very grim, but in the middle of basically sort of cutting away this body down to the bone, Gull has this vision of the future, which is horrifying to him. And as he says, the act of violence, some trigger in the brain, as if it were, and then immediately looks around and finds himself in the modern day. And he gives this long speech about the kind of the fact that it seems disgusting and it seems repulsive and overwhelming to him, but yet it's also the thing that he's brought into being through his actions. So we have this idea of this kind of capitalist religion is not just, this capitalist theology is not just trying to secure its power now, but it reaches back into the past, going all the way back to the very dawn of recorded history, to instantiate and concretize itself into the future. And the third point, this idea of capitalism as a religion of guilt. So I said that asking who's the Ripper is the wrong question to ask. And From Hell shows that the more important question is, of what is the Ripper a function? If we talk about who, That's an issue of individualism, and it creates an unnecessary and, I think, false distinction between the violence of the Ripper's crime and the normative functioning of capitalist modernity. You know, we live enmeshed in systems of violence, and the whole point is that if we go, well, it was this one person, we have obscured a lot of the systemic causes and systemic issues that give rise to it. Who's responsible? According to Moore and From Hell, maybe all of us are. Not all of us. The people that come in for the most criticism are the Crown, the political and kind of economic authorities of Britain. But a few examples. Here is our no-good prince, the cad, the bounder, the rotter, who comes to one of the final victims because he knows that she's going to be murdered in 2 days. And he says, she says to him, "You should be bloody sorry. 2 days. Oh, Jesus, go on, clear off and leave me alone." Yes, I'll go. I'm sorry. Does nothing. Royalty does nothing. Annie Crook, who the prince gets pregnant and then is imprisoned in Guy's Hospital, meets the prince because of this man on the left-hand side of the first panel. This is Walter Sickert, who was a very famous Victorian artist and was also responsible for the prince's education. So at the start of From Hell, the prince introduces himself as Albert and says that he is Walter's brother. And Marie, who has been hired to help with the child, comes back to see Walter Sickert with the little girl, Alice. "Listen, Marie, the business with Annie, I've been meaning to explain." "What wants explaining?" says Marie. "Your royal friend had his fun. A working woman suffered. Why, it's so simple. Little Alice here can fathom it." "Marie, please, I swear I didn't know it would go this far." "Like you swore Prince Collar and Cuffs was your brother." That's a nice bit of 19th century slang. That is how the prince was referred to, thanks to his distinguished sense of fashion. "Oh, yes, I tumbled after Annie's capture, who your Albert must be. A pity it is I didn't tumble before. That poor woman's in Guy's madhouse now. Do you think after you've painted us, you can throw away the original? God, you ought to be ashamed." Sickert then goes for a walk through London, and I will show you what happens on his walk in just a moment. Here we have Victoria herself being implicated. "Our grandchild and his wife have been forcibly separated, and the boy severely chastened. The woman, one Anne Crook, has been taken to Guy's Hospital to await your attentions. We have promised our grandson that she will not feel the fullest extent of our displeasure, but if this scandal is not to rock the throne, she must be silenced. We leave it in your hands, Sir William. That is all." The scene where William essentially tortures Annie Crook is deeply kind of upsetting. It's genuinely really quite horrifying. And Sickert goes wandering through London and finds Annie in the streets. "Oh God, Annie, is that Annie? You're supposed to be in the hospital." Because she returns and is then taken back to Guy's Hospital by a local policeman. And finally, here we have the prince on the moors in Scotland with his good friend Jem. "I'm sorry, Jem, you're such a good chap to put up with me. It's just that these dreadful murders, I feel, I don't know, responsible." "Eddie, that's nonsense. Just because you'll be king, you can't feel responsible for every subject. It's not just that. Terrible things are done in my name." And really, the kind of point that I want to try and get at with this is that From Hell points out that terrible things are done in quite a lot of people's names, and maybe our names, and maybe there are terrible things happening now done in our names that we do not know about, or perhaps choose not to know about. No clean hands is the kind of driving message. Everybody is implicated, and even those who are trying to do good in the system end up either being at best complicit with it or actively obscure the truth, like Fred Aberline, who we opened with in the very first panel that I showed you. So the Ripper brings modernity into existence, but in From Hell, the Ripper is connected to the legal, medical, constitutional, and political authorities of British society. So society is implicated in the violence of the time. there is a very kind of chilling line that Gull whispers as he's hugging the dead body of one of these women. "You would have been dead in a year," he says. "I saved you." In a way, he says that I've made her immortal. She's now become a legend. She would have been dead in a year from drink or a man anyway. So how does this violence resonate? What does the Ripper do now? Which leads us to a familiar question. What is the fourth dimension? Can history then be said to have an architecture, Hinton? The notion is most glorious and most horrible. What is the fourth dimension? One of the most important points about From Hell is the theoretical interest in the nature of time. So within the text, Sir William Withy Gull is friends with James Hinton, who is another famous medical authority of the time, very interested in kind of social medicine, trying to help the poor. Hinton's son is a real-life mathematician, Charles Hinton. It's Hinton Jr., Charles Hinton, who proposes the idea that time is a spatial dimension. The name of Charles Hinton's pamphlet is "What is the Fourth Dimension?" The argument is that all time is essentially coexistent and would be visible and might be invisible to us as three-dimensional perceptance. But in the fourth dimension, we would see that history has an architecture. Obviously, this ties into kind of Nietzschean theories of eternal recurrence, and it becomes one of the most important points that Moore makes in the entire text about the impact of the Ripper myth. So here we have Hinton talking to Gull. Fourth dimensional patterns within eternity's monolith would, he suggests, here talking about his son Charles, seem merely random events to third dimensional perceptance. Events rising towards inevitable convergence like an archway's lines. Let us say something peculiar happens in 1788. A century later, related events take place. Then again, 50 years later, then 25 years, then 12. An invisible curve rising through the centuries. And we might contrast this actually with the moral panicking about comics that emerged in 1909, the moral panicking that emerged with Coleridge's review of The Monk and the trash of the circulating libraries, the moral panics that emerge about culture and violence in the 2000s. There is this kind of invisible curve rising through the centuries. Towards the end of the book, Gull confesses. He is put on trial by a secret Masonic court and is imprisoned in a lunatic asylum, and he has a delusion or a vision of the future. His violence becomes the catalyst of modernity, fractally repeated through the 20th century. That chapter refers to Robert Louis Stevenson, who wakes one night from a fearsome, horrifying dream of a man who stalks London, trampling women underfoot. Peter Sutcliffe appears in the novel. Ian Brady appears. There is this invisible curve of violence that rises through the centuries. So the kind of question is, how do we understand the occult economy of violence upon which capitalism is founded? And to paraphrase and to misappropriate an old Marxist quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of violent domination. One of the final panels that Gull features in is this kind of voiceover. Oh, let's just jump back. Below the skin of history are London's veins that pulse and glisten with significance, that course with energy and meaning, and I am that meaning, and I am that energy. So at the end of the book, Abeline hears Gull's confession, but is ordered to enjoy a quiet retirement with a generous pension. And here he's talking with Mr. Lees, who was Victoria's psychic. And Lee says, but that's just the thing. It isn't just stories. Be easy to dismiss it if it were, but it isn't just stories. Those women really died. And poor Druitt, so Monty Druitt is framed for the Ripper murders by the Masonic Order, caught up in something he could never understand. That's all done with, though, says Abeline. That's all gone. All that's left is what people can read about. Chapbooks and tombstones, Mr. Lees. Chapbooks and tombstones. So I want to finish with a kind of question that maybe people will have some responses to, and we can talk a little bit about. Is a quote from Theodore Adorno. If one were drafting an ontology in accordance with the basic state of facts, of the facts whose repetition makes their state invariant, such an ontology would be pure horror. And I just want to kind of think through that question of what would it mean to write such an ontology? What would it mean to acknowledge that our shared condition is one of being implicated in a vast network of horrors? I wanted to finish with Lee's really interesting and kind of loaded remark, I think, for a writer to put into a piece about fictionalizing history. I made it all up, and it all came true anyway. That's the funny part. So where are we? Where are we when we're trying to reckon with this question of the ethics of horror? We're in the most extreme and utter region of the human mind, a human subconscious underworld, a dim subconscious underworld, a radiant abyss where men meet themselves. Hell, Netley. We are in hell. Thank you very much. I will stop there.